Okay, morning, Tashirule. So this is our last and final day of the winter research workshop, and I'll save my comments for the end, but this has been just an extraordinary, I think, 2 weeks for at least Nicole and me, and hopefully it's been a good experience for you all.
아니 대대링 아주 공개 sab종기 때 니마 타마디 차대라 아니 겐라코랑기 때 지금 삼수슈 카직 단데 제라 아니 슈라그레스 아니 단다 마 슈데 디카르총 슬라바이나 딘다니디 아니 겐라코란다 겐니골라 쳔바이나 다 할레기 아니 된다 침북이 된다니도 차선스 안 넘버 솔레 된데 차이베라 와슈구여스.
So I was asked a question at breakfast that I think was important because it reminds me that I think we need to clarify one point on statistics to help you move forward with your analyses.
아니 쇼게 다 쇼저 최백업수 아니 겐라코란 티와직 티선스 아니 디기 아니 티와디단 데네 아니 세시직 넘버 2 슈네 넘버 2 캠바이나 아니 카르수레 탄다 심주기 다 당도 20단 드즈기 토라 아니 펜도 첨부 연구를 삼기도스.
And the question was, what is a p-value? What is a p-value in statistics? And so I want to clarify that today.
Tiwati kares labaina the bigi rintopse p-value se the kares lani the tiwati so ani the shundu chusos.
Because this is actually a really important statistic as you move forward doing your analyses.
The number two susugi tangdola yeshi any chebe gurim di nanglola and p-value the karimba hakoya di be kechambures.
So in plain speak, the p-value tells you whether or not the difference between the two groups that you're comparing, or for example, between the measurements before and after the meditation in a pairwise t-test, whether or not that contrast is statistically significant.
The p-value like the mikume gets sick the original shubaina. 아니 루가니 기 당도 충돌 지기 연enda 야 루가지기 나로라 공감하던 제기 당도 충돌 제기 연enda 안데 제베가서 군이 바라라 개바 통해줘라 디 개바디 내가 체외 개바레 말에 디 땡캔디레스.
So this was this nice slide that Nicole had about comparing the mean between two groups.
다디 록데니리기 쇼구디나 아니 겐니골라기 카징이 마슈르와 다디 나로라 카레 두르기오레슬라바이나 아니 당도니기 찬염기 당차지라디 펜주 총도 지겨레스.
And in this kind of hypothetical experiment, there were two groups, and those two groups were compared on whether they differed on this self-report measure of emotion called the PANAS. And in this situation, the mean of one group is significantly different than the mean of another group. So group A and group B are statistically different from each other.
Tadi tangdo shisun chebaina remodi karitungi reslabaina ruka tangbo das ruka A dan ruka B nigi channyomgi ani tangchajorwa dila ani kheba yobazamdo mase kheba di nenga chengi kheba imba tungi res.
In this particular situation, the two groups overlap, so you don't see any difference between the mean and the kind of distribution of group A and group B, and they're essentially the same.
Pagi remodigi rugani gi chanyom tangsadila kheba meba tungi res ra.
So in this situation, you may see differences between the mean of group A and group B, say, for example, on the PANIS, but the p-value will tell you whether or not that difference is statistically significant.
다 디낭로라와 루가니기 아니 찬염제라 찬염 trancha 케바 요바디 다 리모나레 세기도 왔어 다 b value기 딘디기 케바 통돼야디 아니 터지기 통에 아니 슈바이나 케바디 케바 땡가 쟁기 케바 라 코파게 슈겐라고 그래 땡가 쟁기 케바 이민디 b value 디기 땡그레스
If you have a p-value less than 0.05, below 0.05, that difference is significant.
The p value the chain p value the lego cha ra lego nga le chungwa yimbaina ani kunigi khebadi ta thajigi thone shubaina khebadi tanga ju ji su rungwa kheba nenga chen yimba ani khogores.
If you have a p-value above or greater than 0.05, the difference between those two groups or between a person before and after is not significantly different.
The p-value di lego cha lego nga le chewa thoa ina ra ta kheba jik thongba ina kheba di nga ju thangji gi thone shuba ina kheba la jigi mares ta ko nenga jing kheba jig chago mares.
If you have a p-value between 0.05 and say 0.09, it's not statistically significant, but it's kind of close. It's a little bit on the fence, if that analogy makes sense.
Da kyan zu kesi p value di cheni p value di lego cha nga da lego cha gui phar le le bai na lego cha thu do da lego cha dün do le bai na ta di ko thaji gi thone shu bai na kheba di nenga chingi kheba mar de ina garo nyebu resta.
So if you're doing a contrast and you want to know whether or not you have a statistically significant effect, you run that contrast and then you go to your table that has the output in JASP and determine whether your p-value is above or below 0.05. If it's below, it's statistically significant.
다 루가 니 편중기 아니 코 장도디 충돌 지기원에다 야 루가 지기 낭로라 nga 지기 장도 충돌 지기 여와이네다 충돌 제네 다 개바지 통구여나 다디 개바디 터지기 토네 nenga 차그도 민도 따고 따야 라스 안 제스 나로라 탄다 b value 디 체기로아 b value 디 레고 창알레 뇽구여나 마와여나 아니 개바디 오네 개발라 지초고 레스타 nenga 쟁기 개발.
So just to give you an example of how this looks, I just heard about this question at breakfast, so I didn't have a lot of time to make a data set. So I just found one of the practice data sets, and I just want to show you what I did, and then to show you where on the JASP output I would look to see whether or not the difference in these two groups is statistically significant.
The tangi shoge any 나와 손자스 안 게라코란 디 타리 제믹세 투즈게 라마손스 임바이나야 디 네주 장도 다가죠 정다 제약이 네주 장도 직 렘바이나 디 낭로라 다가죠 컨테스트네 충도 디 최고래 비 밸류 체야라 카발 도고래 디 직마 젬비슈기 예스.
So this is just a practice data set that I found quickly, and it's a data set that had a number of continuous variables, one of which was the number of years that a person had been meditating.
다디 장도저와 장도디 엔 가장 정다 제기 장도제 다디 낭로라 아니 카르소레 가죠 린톱도죠 아니 균투베 린톱체 엔디 직 카레도 슬라바이나 곰갸야기다 로체 디레샤스.
And another variable was whether somebody was male or female. Now, because male and female is a categorical variable, I was able to move male and female to be the grouping variable, so it's categorical. And then I moved the meditation years to the dependent variable.
아니 다 곰기 고뮨 로날 제샤베 고뮨 제라디 아니 뜨베 규르케 임바 손자 뜨베 규르케 날디 샤브레스.
And then because this question here is asking whether males and females differ on the number of years that they've been meditating, I did an independent samples t-test because that's a good analysis for that type of question.
tatanda di nanglo la pomoni para la gom gaya gi lo se la kheba yume tagi yoba sun zas and dinde gi ani thasi ani jebe kapsu independent t test ya di ani ko chambu chagi yore chezang gela gi di ani chota di cheba is.
So then I clicked on a few of these boxes. I clicked on descriptive to get information about the mean and standard deviation for males versus females on average number of years of meditating.
Ta di nanglo ne ta khashe si dam yores chik ti thanda descriptive la di dam barwa di ta descriptive nanda ganjo dejo gi ani thaji ki ta descriptive che di nanglo lo cho khar tong gi resla na ani chanyom di khar resha ra ani ta ganjo standard deviation di khar resha di tong gi res.
I then also just clicked on descriptive plots, and the benefit of that is I get to see a figure of males and females, so I can visually see whether males and females are different.
Tene tamia chikti tanda deje gi remote res descriptive plots edi and di nanglo la ani phage thangdo khangi ba di chi ngajo remue lamla shar ne ngara mix ngoi su mi gi thong thoye.
So let's actually start at the bottom here. This is the figure of whether males and females differ on the number of years that they've practiced meditation in this particular data set.
Tadi remote haritungyo reslaba ina ani thangdo di nanglo las ani phoda moi para la gom ya gi yunsela ani kheba du mi do di tungyo res.
On this axis we have female and we have male.
Ta thegi ani changdi digala ani moda post lani dus khoyores.
On the vertical axis, or what sometimes the horizontal axis, is meditation in years, where low numbers is very few years of meditating and higher numbers are higher years of meditating.
Ta phage shungthik sene da y changdi jora tila ani gomgi ani loyundi ani töyores ta ma di lo ni ne chene thoa lo chobge phardo.
And without worrying about the statistics, which group looks higher? Oh, well, let me make one more point. These dots here are the means of years of meditation, and these bars are the spreads of variation, meaning those kind of metrics of standard deviation.
Ta di nanglo la chekni do chekni digi ani gomyungi ta chanyom dire tunggi ores ra sosone ani thik narmo digi dindegi chanyom la ani khebara khatsus tugi yeme di tunggi ores standard deviation.
Just from looking at the figure, which group do you think is higher on meditation years, males or females?
Ta remote ran la te ne ani khanzugi phoda moi nanglo la ani gom gaya gi yunse chanyom ani su ani chewatsi sares.
Females. So you might look at this figure and say, wow, we've got some breaking news to report. Women meditate more than men.
That remote la te ne khanzu chikchina ta ngazu sangyu sawa shuch to de pome chogi ani phola to de ani gom manga jagi dos la ni lap sito gores.
But then, let's go a little bit deeper. The next step is to look at the descriptive statistics, and we do see that women look like they practiced meditation in this sample for about 9.8 years, and men for about 5.8 years. So there is a difference in the number of years that women and men meditated.
Tangazu desik da ship sa su roji rowa ina roa joni ani phage thanga du zo ngoi su te ba ina roa ani moda da phoi paralas chanyom gom gi yunse chanyom pab yundu ani mola gu cha ge da ani phola nga cha ge tinde thoba thong thu doas.
So then we might continue to say, wow, we found an effect, we found a meaningful effect.
Tadi thongwa sonza mutu ne nga zo wow di kheba ngone chimbu reshas tensi res.
But then we need to ask ourselves, is the difference between men and women in the number of years practiced in which they practice meditation statistically significantly different from each other?
Ta tene nga zo thiwaji thine ro ta di kheba di ngone thaji gi thone ji yundus 아니 개바디 오늘 내가 전부지 레도 레메도스네 때 제와딜레 쪽으로 왔어.
And so this becomes a very important table when you start to interpret your data right here.
제자다 수수기 장도 렘바저와디 아니 예시 제백값수 스타디페 여기 강기류미데 시라기 내가 전부 차로 그랬어.
So we can read here, it says independent samples t-test, so we know that this table is the output of the statistical test whether these two groups differ.
또 여기 가운데라 independent samples t-test 라디 고 최다 제들와 디기다 루가니 나로 장도 렘바디 오늘 타지기 전에 아니 고 내가 내제 레드 레메도디 땡고요레스.
The t-value here is the statistical output of this analysis in the t-statistic. It's a number that basically the larger this number is, the more likely your comparison is statistically significant.
단다 티기 린덥지도아 디 안기디 가르청기요레 슬라바이나 파기 안기디 statistically significant, right? 디기와 아니 탈지기 토니 슈바이나 고 내가 체중기 체시드레스 지잠기 티기 린덥디 토아요와 대수기 아니 고 탈지기 tum레디 아니 탈지기 토네 내가 체와 자기요레스.
The suspense to get to the p-value. Oops. Or did my computer go to sleep? Oh, my computer went to sleep. I'm sorry. Dramatic effect. Okay. This DF here is degrees of freedom. And that's actually just your sample size. It's actually your sample size minus 1. But this number here you don't need to worry about at the present time.
Then the DF like the degrees of freedom karsore the rawangi seshi suraj di karitungge reslava ina phage nyamshu chingegi thangadi dineni ma chik themba dres chesan di tanda kyan jo mixe di thona ma chen digres.
But this value is very important in interpreting your effect. This is your p-value right there.
tanda big rinthobjero da di one nenga chembu chage res ra phage da khuni chungdu cheba di nenga chembu redo min zi go do min do se di digi tengres.
So looking at this table here, I'll ask you the question, do men and women statistically differ in this particular sample in the number of years that they meditate?
da tanda de la pi rinthop de la tenes ane number sugi da choda di nanglo la ane phoda moi para la ane gomgi yinse gi kheba dres do adi thaji gi thone nenga chimbu zi gosare gosa mares. No.
No.
It's not statistically.
So even, this is a good example, even though you see a mean difference on the plot, even though you see a mean difference on the years, the groups are not statistically different.
저다 된다 가지고 리문낭로 le kheba chimbu shorge ba thongwa inainda ro ya phage ngoso thangala te dende gi kheba chimbu thona yas ta di thaji gi thone ani kheba de chigi nenga chimbu rewe baslana member di phage b value di gi tengyores.
So as you start to run your analyses and you're comparing group A versus group B, or maybe you're doing a pairwise t-test where you're comparing people before and after, you run your analyses, you get your descriptive statistics, and then what you want to do is you want to look at your p-value, and that p-value will tell you whether the groups are statistically significant.
that number sugi susugi any simju nanglo la ra ani thangdo yeship chebe kapsus ra ta di ruga ni gi para la kheba do min do tagi yone da ya ruga chi gi nga chi gi kheba do min do tagi yone da di ta we kapsu ra ani p value di chene ani p value di gi ani ko kheba ngom ba ina ra ani kheba di nenga chembu re do re min do ani nge thu res.
Now, you might say, well, wow, why aren't these p-values significant? Why is this not a statistically significant effect? It looks like this mean is higher than that mean.
제가 파게 리모랑 라테바이나 아니 개발 여바 라 찬염디 피메기 찬염디 아니 가서 개발기 창념래 토와여바시라 토와여바디 땡기여데 이나야 p value 딘데 마요가 가리나스라니 텐시기로스.
And there's two reasons why this difference is not statistically significant.
내가 디 군인이 내가 타지기 돈에 내가 마임베 내가 전부 마임베 균생이 요레스들라.
The first issue is because this is a very small sample size. We only have 10 females and only 9 males.
당보디 카레슬라바이나 가족이다 샘플기 체준제로아디 충타브레스 로 아니 피메 아니 주다 부굴마도 게제티오 마르와.
Many of you this past year continue to do the same study you did the first year, but you went and got more people. So group 8, for example, had 11 people last year, and then this year they went and got like, I think 33 people per group, if I'm correct on that. And so they basically doubled their sample size, or more than doubled their sample size in each group.
디 가르소레 파게 딱제 제사저라 디게 장가디 마우 마타와 이나야 툼데딘데 퉁거라 디 마수자 남버스기 로 당볼라 심주 체베값수 아니 파게 딱제 장가 디로아 디 마우체 라 베나루가 제와 이나 페지 죽지더부체 안데 인자한테 로니벌라 캬주기 심주디 무투디 아니 디 샘플 사이즈 디 망도 타네 심주 소송 타야 어데니 나여바스.
And the reason why we tell you to go out and get more people and collect more people for your studies is because the likelihood of a difference becoming statistically significant is much higher the more people you have. And the reason for that is that the more people you have, statistically, the more confident we can be that that's a real effect. And it's not just something that happens by chance. And that's why increasing your sample size dramatically increases the likelihood that any mean difference between the groups would be significant statistically.
더 견라 혼주기 캬줄로 더디 파게 딱지 시사기 샘플디 아니 체와 구글에 캬주 미망아 아니 지게 디나로라 냠슈체 랭고레스라니 숭고에 기 견젠디 디레스 로그 샘플 사이즈 디 충타바이나 디나로라 캬바 통바이나 캬바디 직시나 랑거 딘데 용시게레스 지점기 샘플 사이즈 체와여바 디츠기 군이 루가니 바라라 캬바 두르인데 캬바 템바딜라 아니 터지기 돈에 nenga 체로 누구요 레스 고 당도 뉴뉴지마도 칼소레 파게 샘플 뉴뉴지마도 메나 디기 해바디코 곰야베 슈겐기 아니 이마 시기레라 마임바에 시기레스 겐셴바기 왕기 임바 칼소 케바도야 디인디 지점기 샘플 사이즈 채워봐 디츠기 아니 당도 데 예십체디 둠제라 아니 터지기 돈에 nenga 체로 누구레스.
The other reason why this effect is not statistically different is because the bigger these bars are, the bigger these error bars are, that means that the more variance there is in the sample. And the more variance there is in the sample, you know, this error bar spread overlaps with this error bar spread, which says that even though the means are different, the distributions are not statistically different. And that's why we're seeing this not be a p-value less than 0.05.
더 균생이바디로와 디게 더 레모나 디 나리디게 텐디 레스 디 레모디 가르된 게 레슬라바이나 아니 코 당도 디 낭로라 켜바 가서 전부 쇼르기요바 로아 디 마인디다 탄다데라 레모니 두르바이나 나리니 두바이나 나리니가 디펜즈인 널용도 와스 널용디 지단 찬염라 켜바 쇼바이나야 코 찹제라 아니 켜바 메바 로아 지기지글라 뇌기요바 딘데기 인자 디 찹세디 지점기 채워요 대수기 양 군인이기 바르기 개바디 내가 전부 마임바 차두레스.
So the take-home point is when you're starting to do comparisons in JASP between two groups or between people before and after, look at your descriptive statistics, look at your plots, but then you need to look at your p-value to determine whether the difference is significant. And if it's above 0.05, it's not significant, and if it's below 0.05, it is significant.
디인디 가르소레 캬주 디니니 캐르고야기다 nenga소라디 가르레 라바이나 아니 당도 27그와 당도 27인디 찬염 체그레 아니 콘조 캬바 가르르고도 체그와 다 체네 아니 개 첨부 타지기 돈을 찍고에 찍디 다 비그린 톱드레스 자 비그린 톱디 아니 레고 차 레고 nga레 마와 여바이나 다 케바디 더 곰갸니 이나 곰갈 딱세 지기요나 곰갸니 케바 쇼와임바 아니 타지기 토네 땡기어레스 야지게 셴바지 지기요나 디기 토네 케바 쇼와디 아니 타지기 토네 땡투고레스 라 비기 린톱디 레고 차 레고 nga레 체와이나 라 안딘데기 탕자 차뇽라 케바 쇼와이네 케바디 바게 더 곰갸니 임바 디 아니 둑투기 마레스 심주디기 토네.
Is that any questions on this? Because this is important because the p-value will really determine how you interpret your data, how you write it up, how you write your discussion section and everything. So I wanted to make sure that this was clear about.
That p-value di nenga chimbu shiures p-value la shikde. That the p-value di the soeke marwa kotsene korangi karilewa in this shusongi any page tumde nyeba nyedon de la ani kyangi tunde jaya inenda ra ani karsure tumde page tunya inenda de sangma dila ra legires chesa dinenga chimbu yinza number 2 ya di kala sebu mena and tiwana ronas mi dukja khajudo al semba khandes dam gore sombe symbol dudan di khandes du gore ra mi kya kesi du aina thanga ga ja ale okay. So what would be a significant number that would be considered as a good sample size?
That's a great question. I would say that for group contrasts, group comparisons in your research in this ETSI research workshop, if you could get 25 to 30 people per group, you're getting pretty good.
Tanda kyanzugi shimju nangya chora emri da pyogi tsenri lerim gyune shimju nangde duzu tabula chomba inas an di nanglo la ta kharso rukha ni chu lene khoni la ane chungdur chigi yona ro ani rukha re na la mi nishsanga ne sumju chungba ina an di sample cheche di tagda phije chagres.
It doesn't mean that a difference is going to be significant, but this effect probably would be significant if we had 25 men and 25 women.
So that the nisanga dune eko kuni ibara kebar ani nengar chengi kebar tungresta keshu tu maresra the imba ina ya nisanga ne sumju yoba ina ra ani karsure sample nyung thawe kyendi chag mares ra pena chashabana didawla nisanga doji lentu yona ra ani sample chung thawe kyendi ani jugu mares.
There's one other point I want to make which also is important. The p-value does not tell you the direction of the effect, okay? It doesn't tell you whether men have more years of meditation or females have more years of meditation. It just tells you whether or not the group is statistically different from each other.
tanda ya nenga chenbu chik shue shunde kharachong slabaina p value khorangi rwa ani ti kunini chanyom la khebar shorwa di khagi chola mangado khagi chola nyungado di tengyo mares rwa p value kharadang kheba di thajigi thoni shubaina nenga chenbu resha remindu di temba cham remado ya chige phimegi ani chanyom thang che di thoado phugaji di maado di tinde p value ni ragi mares ning mares.
So if the males were up here and the females were down here in the same way, the p-value would be the same number, right? So the p-value doesn't tell you who's higher or who's lower. It just tells you whether or not the comparison is statistically significant.
Dile kodo nerwa ani keba ga changdo di ya thoa che ani peme gi thangdo di ma chini kunini kodo dogba ina b value chikba thokres ra chaza b value gi ra chanyom khagi thoadu khagi ma du di hetung mares khari tungere lana kuni bara kheba dila thaji gi thone nenga yume di cham tungres.
So if you do get a significant effect, then what you need to do is you need to look at your descriptive statistics and the figure of means to tell you whether or not the significant difference is driven by higher males or higher females. That's going to be the information you need to tell yourself whether or not the difference is driven by one group or the other and in which direction. Is that, yeah?
the p value de la lego cha lego nga le ma yin bai na ta kho thaji ge thone nga du lab ge ro ani nenga yo ba shin be je las an khebar shoria di khawa ni shor do ti shin di ani tanda riumik du zu ne shin ge re remote du zu ne shin ge res ro je nenga yo ba ina da nenga di pime chögi gom manga jawe gyunzen du chene nenga chashas yana puchogi ene gom manga jane nenga chashas di shenya di ko riumi di da ani remote zo le shen go le ma to pi gi thone shen thu ma res pi gi ren thok.
Is that clear? Okay. Okay, thank you for asking that question. I think that's a really important clarification, and I'm glad that we were able to talk through this, and we can talk through this more. And if you would, maybe anyone who's not here, just kind of mention this to them, because as they start to analyze their data, especially group 3, given that they're sleeping for after the overnight, just mention this to them so that people are brought up to speed on this important issue.
Dadi tiwa di nangba di nangbal tuchana shugin isra tiwa di ta tandanga zugi leshi di labe nenga chambu chagi yorwa di indi namba tsu ruga nanglo ne mi ma changwa yona ane khonzu la jela di sung sharo ches lakbar du ruga di imba ina dangwa ta khonzu changdo lemba sunza kha chik tandanga su kya tiyo res.
So we were, before a couple days ago, we were in the middle of we were in the middle of having conversation about the future of compassion and contemplative science.
Nima khashe chunga la nganzo ani gomru gi tsenri yorwa di gi ta maung khapcho do khari yungure di kola thudu ji nangba imbas.
And just as a reminder, the reason we're having this conversation is because one, you have tremendous history on this topic in your particular tradition, but two, Mind and Life, which many of you may know, is starting to kind of really think about what's the future of contemplative science in the Mind and Life organization.
Ta di ko la nganzu thudu chekwa yunzen chik samlo tang bai nas ani yunzen chik de khares lana number 2 di nanglo la ani gomru gi kor gi ta kharsu rang zo rikshung sora di pe thachang gi chukpu yore ani lugyu ring bu shibu yores ani nibadi tanda semda so gi tine khran so gi ta khonzo gomru chengri kala nyamship cheya da di shukchim bu chigi yo sonja khonzo ngene an khari samlo ta go chu res shubaina gomru chengri di ta khapcho khande chila to sares lani dinde gi ta kala khonzo samlo ta go chu yores.
And the new president of Mind and Life is very interested in incorporating monastic and monastic scientists into the Mind and Life future.
Ta thanda semda sogi ani chokba digi chokso saba di imba ina ra ani de gomrup chengri gi nanglo la ani chi gonde kha ki ani ta di nanglo la gonde kha ki ta khoto da rikshung da ani phage lomnye nange chu di nanglo la kheryong ya ani khran deba chimbu yores.
And so this conversation that we'll have, the notes from this conversation, we'll send to Mind and Life because we want to incorporate this conversation into the vision statement of Mind and Life's perspective on the future of contemplative science.
Antanda ngazu thudu cheba di ani dinanglo ne da chige samlo leba duzu ani Mind and Life tanda khonzu semda so gi chogwal pha tang ne tang ya is ra ta kharsure ta ningji di gomru chengri nanglo leung gorwa an di gala ani nabachu ani kongchar leba digi khonzu khranzu gi jema ani chashitingya da duzula an tende shugen jugres.
And so the first question we asked ourselves is, how should we define compassion for research on compassion science?
Ta ngazu thiwa khashesila dos chebarwa dinan thiwa thangbodi ta ningji gi chhenri ani karsure ningji gi chhenri da ningji le simju cheya las ani ngola ningji de khandes ngunjin chegu res lai di kala ngazu thidu chebarwa.
And you all gave a wonderful, we had a wonderful conversation, which for me really deeply confirms how important it is to bring your perspective into the field of contemplative and compassion science, because to be honest, I think the way that the field is defining compassion in the research world is very shallow. And I think your deep investigations is so profound that it could really help inform the field of compassion science.
다 가장 저도 전에 ene number 저기 공자 송샤바드죠. 네니 할래기 사보다 축부 디레 다 차데레스 임바선자 드조 다 콘졸라 피바이나 아니 곰루 생리지다 아니 인지 생리가라 아니 심주스에 심주 제백값소 콘조 심주 제겐 최기 아니 삼로드조 셴바이나 로 아니 더 카르소레 닝지세 등은 진체야디 아니 직삽도 줘야다 아니 축도 줘바이나 심주 코나라 켜바수 그레스 단대차라 아니 다 닝지가라 딱제 제대겐 생리바만 체기 닝지 고도디 닝지 고아디 다고 띵사부케 요
We then, oh, you good?
Mas bebe tsikla shallow la anything sabu maimba la madu tsik todo jiminda. Ting ringu da ting tung tung la ora.
So then we mentioned that there's actually 4 ways that compassion is being studied in the context of compassion and contemplative science. This involves self-report, behavior, brain, and physiological metrics.
Dene nga zugi da ningji la simju cheyundi ra ningji ko gi thangtho lendan che ra di ani chu shi gi ko ne lengi yoba jik shu barwas jik di ani di che karsure kunjo ge thone jik che ra ani lebe ge logri che be thone jik che ani leba dan lukham gi ani thone jik che. Then what is the fourth? So
Physiology, so self-report.
당보대 건다 수수기 아니 영화 주베 라톤이 장도 랭치니 시 요레스.
And we had a really nice conversation on the challenges and of self-report measures for studying compassion.
다 디나로네 다 당보대 수수기 영화 티베 토네 장도 랭디라 아니 강에 가르테시기레 디 토랑 아주 저도 록부 총소마스.
So just to give you a brief summary of this conversation, we talked about the challenge of people being able to report on their own emotions, that sometimes people aren't very good reporters of their own emotions.
안디나로 다 강에 텐소게 쳐도 슈바이나 강에 찍디 아니 수수기 영화디 딱다 줘 마투가 지네 라 망고지기 줘 투마라디 강에 지어레스.
We talked about the fact that maybe there's cultural differences in how people define compassion and what those cultural differences might mean in terms of research on this topic.
Humility.
Yeah, humility and different kind of cultural perspectives of compassion and emotion.
dene nibadi ani susu rikshun nanglo tadangi thone ani susu khang yongwa di tada ya chigi lab malab ki kange chigi yungres lani songsomas.
Let's make this bigger. We talked about the importance of how we phrase the question, that the way we ask the question of compassion has really important effects on how people respond, because the question really drives the response.
dine kange chi khari yong sigires lana ani thiwa thidangi thone ro ani lendi ya takta chi ra maragi kheba do ya dine yungurwas Tiwa koedang gitone ko tiwa koedang handis ko ma ko digitone lendi jagdan la kheba dugurwas.
We talked about the fact that sometimes people aren't honest in which they report their self-reported compassion.
And then dana shin da dinalo mi khashegi ko thangbo ma che bachine lengyang yong chogurwas.
And you mentioned that in Tibetan cultures, people may be more humble, and even though they may feel very compassionate, say if it's a 5-point scale, they may rank themselves as more like a 2 on a 5-point scale, because it wouldn't be appropriate to say that you're that compassionate.
다는 신다 리슈 나로랑 아주 예다 지게 마사 송야 여바이나 한 디나로라다 수수기 닝지 세시디야 강마마 라베아딘데 영구르와스 영구레슬란 송스와스.
By contrast, in a highly individualistic and, dare I say, slightly narcissistic country like America, people might actually say that they're like a 5 on a compassion scale, when in fact they may not be that compassionate. So the idea is that people often report what they think they should report rather than what they're actually feeling.
드네야 지조 가시 나로라 페나다 랑시 라고레다 디 첨부 여되게 라 랑통 첨부 여되게 게 지조 나로라야 닝지 세심 마우이네야 나이 스능에데 용촉으로 봤어 라 the last part I think I skipped. I forgot the last part, but it's okay. I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean the point is that people often report what they think they should be reporting, and that what they think they should be reporting is in part influenced by their culture. So American culture very much promotes the self, and so people will often over-report being something good because that's a cultural drive in America.
저전에 리숑기 개발기 라 아니야 카르소레 ngoyene 강이 말라와체 라 아니 지속이 아니 가리 아니 레와야기레 디나 신치네 아니 랭자야 된데 용구여와스 라 저자 랑시 첨부 여경기 지소낭로라야 랑통 첨부 영경기 지소낭로라 수수기 연된도 토 지게 ngoyene 저다 마튠바 토아줘야 된데 용구여레스.
The final point I'd like to make on what I see as a real challenge of self-report measures for studying compassion is something in the field of psychology that we call demand characteristics.
Demand characteristics. 아니 야 디게 신자 직라 단다 셈캄기 아니 셈캄 릭바낭로라 디 아니 신자디라 demand characteristics. 어디 랍기 어레스.
And this is a phrase used in psychological research that I think poses a challenge for programs like C-Learning and CBCT.
단다 셈캄 릭베 나로라 단다 demand characteristics 라이치도아 디기 아니 C-Learning 다 CBCT W 레림도 줄라 야 지 강에 지 트시기레스.
And what a demand characteristic is in this context is that if you have people come in and do, say, for example, an 8-week course to increase their compassion, people will often be motivated to tell the researchers that the compassion program worked because everyone worked really hard to do the program, they worked really hard to take the program, and so there's a certain motivation to kind of put a positive spin on things, and this is very common in psychological research.
디 베나르와 지닝지 닝지 정다기 레림지 임바이나 아니 콘조 따데 렙네 아니 둔라게 기른가라 sabjonte 라 다 sabjon 후다바다테 제버선 제네니 다 tumde 가르쳐서 제버티운디 안 파게 제버티사도 저기 오다 콘조 깔레시우 갸스노 가조에 깔레시우 갸이디 인자 안디 다 tumde 야고 텐송슬라네 아니 라야지 꿀론지 레용거라 디겐체네 아니 고 ngoyne주 멤버 ngoyne주 가리나야 디갈라데스 넘베게 소라치 용구여레스 상초기.
So none of these issues are fatal, but whenever you do research, it's just good to have awareness of the challenges so that we as researchers can, be prepared and kind of help manage that.
다두즈 강에다 레데 이네 강에디 파게 심주데 벳 톨라당에 강에서라든데 게 말레스 다 이네 가서 심주 쟁해지 임베 차네 강에든데 테스바다 용세바디 신야디 아니 개침부 자게어레스.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to go through this question of the challenges and opportunities for the 4 main types of compassion research that are happening today.
다 딩을 슈바나 신체네 다 탄다 가르소레 닝지가라 더 심주 조심바디 장도 두에 저라디 추식 거네 두고 여봐 손자
Can take notes on behavior.
추유도 저 아니 레레레레 내가 저다 주도 시행이스.
So the second domain that I want to go through is research that's happening, not measuring people's self-reported response of compassion, but actually measuring their behavior, right? So studies that are actually measuring their behavior.
단다 마슈에디 카린슬라바이나 닝지 심주 강시기 아니 도다 소설라게 아니 영화계자 마티바체네 콘주기 군주라 아니 가르소레 군주기 장도래야 든데기 심주디 슈에 마슈긴스.
Because if compassion is a warm-hearted feeling that drives somebody to try to ameliorate another person's suffering or fix another person's suffering, one way as researchers that we could study compassion is to see whether or not people are actually acting compassionately.
저다 닝지세디 아니 생기 동에를 미스네 엔텔에 다코 동에를 전도기 제외 넘버 젠지 임바이나 라 아니 닝지 코 공패로도 로면도 다사 찍디 고랑기 군주라 교와 라 코시엔라 펜베 아니 레가딘데 망아 치기도 면도 군주라 아니 다야 찍이 여러바스.
So let me give you an example of a study in which the researchers tried to study compassionate behavior.
더 제가 더 닝지기 아니 가서 남주르마소나 아니 심주지기 낭로라 닝지기 다 남주된데 아니 따네 아니 딱제 세베된데 기 배선식 슈기인스.
So one example was that researchers had people go through a compassion training program, and then they also had a group of people who were the control group who did not go through a compassion training program.
디 심주 낭로라 아니 루가 찍라 더 닝지기 정다디테 아니 루가 심바 찍라 디 마테네 땅지 루가 냐바레스.
And then what they did is after people went through this, long compassion training program, they had them come into the laboratory to I think fill out some questionnaires or something like that. So they scheduled them for a laboratory visit.
this 닝지 정다 저겐다 마저겐 도저다 고 정다 차비제라 다제 칸 주게 따네 아니 티소지 렌갸주레스.
But what the participant of the study didn't know is that when they came into the waiting room for the experiment, they were actually participating in the study right there. The researchers didn't care so much about the questionnaires they were measuring. They actually cared about how the participant was going to behaviorally respond in the waiting room of the study.
디치디 콘조다 다제 칸나로라 티조 랭게 디체버와 다파게 국사기 강바저라 디낭로라 아니 미츠 냠슈바 냠슈 제겐 저기 군저 가래도 디 콘조기 독십 체버레스 오네 제나 티소기 렌디 콘조 대와 차게요 마레스.
And so when the participant came into the waiting room, they sat down in the waiting room and there were other people in the waiting room.
저도 냠슈바디 코 파게 용두라 파게 국사기 강바나 구베 값수 미셴바딘데 요레스디나라.
And those other people were actors. They were not actually participants in the study, they were actually actors.
때 미셴바도 코 심주나 냠슈 체게 마레스 콘조 다 스탑된 바딘데 레스.
And so one of the actors, I think, faked having an injury and was having a hard time getting into their chair, or I can't remember all the details, but they basically were faking as though they were having a hard time and really struggling.
디나로라 탑된바 지기다 강바데와 메 연도도 체네 한 코란 데살라 데마투와 투기메바 지 강에 체기여 받은데 지 탑레스.
The other actors in the room didn't do anything, so they didn't actually get up and help the person who was struggling. And the dependent variable in this study is whether or not the person who was the participant, i.e. the person who went through the compassion training program, got up to help the person who was struggling.
디낭로라 되베 유르체디 카레슬라바이나 냠슈바 디기스 라 네단 디낭로라 아니 야랑네 코라 따지 곰야 닝지 곰켄디기 라 곰니지 정다 조켄디기 야랑네 로바치기도 민도 다야드레스.
And so researchers had like cameras in the room or something like that, so they could monitor whether or not the person got up to help the person, and they could also monitor how helping the person was. Were they actually really helping or just kind of partially helping, etc.
dadi khangba nanglo la chigi parche ji shane ndi thone ra midigi ngune rogwa chigi do mindu rogwa cheso maso ani rogwa che di ngune karsure cha sangbuji redo remindu yana chashe chamji redo di changma ani nyen lembres.
And the researchers found that if people had gone through the compassion program, the compassion training program, they were more likely to get up and help people who were struggling.
다 심주디기 녀든 가리니에 버레슬라바이나 라 아니 디 미디스 고 딩요라 닝지기 아니 고 로종 림바디날 도요나 라 아니 셴바디라 되데 야라네 로바체디 망아 용구여바 녀순 좀 버레스.
And there's other types of behavioral studies that people have done. They've given people $100 and they've seen whether they spend that money on themselves or they spend it on other people.
때 심주 가시 낭로 가시기 낭로라 군제 다야디 아니 냠슈 칭야라 고무자지 때네 아니 고무자디 수소갈 당게도야 미셴발라 당도 디다야.
They have done laboratory experiments where you can do games in a lab, like kind of on a computer screen, and see how much money in a computer game people would distribute to other people versus how much money people would keep for themselves.
다나시야 다제 카시기 낭로라 아니 lokleganla ta tsemuse de swene ani dinanglo nguidinde ani tene ani nguide suso khazu nyagdo mission bal khazu tegido di tayores.
They've done studies in brain scanners, MRI scanners, and EEG studies where they've measured brain activity and see whether or not the levels of brain activity can predict how compassionate somebody is in one of these games, how much money they give, and see whether or not they can actually use the brain to predict how compassionate somebody's behaviors are.
야 딱제 카시기 나로라 아니 레베기 탄다 로리 레야다 아니 두바르기 베주세네 간제 레바 나로라 아코 카르수레 젤레도 칸데 용고도 라 디기 토네 아니 쿠라닝지기 군제데 텐사레 마레 두조 ngombache alaso badakse cheores.
So I have two questions for you. The first question is, given the depth of training that you all have done on compassion in the context of Buddhism, my first question is, what do you think would be, as researchers now, we're all researchers at this point, what do you think would be good behaviors that we could use in research studies to measure compassion? What would you see as important behaviors to capture the essence of compassion?
다 캬ンズ 수수 yapjon 카르소레 축부디 아니 실라샤네스 아니 캬ンズ 다 닝지갈 다체 체겐지기 ngoyo 토네 삼로 땅바이나 라 아니 닝지기 군제 가기기 라 닝지 다 카르소레 ngazo 닝지 체제야라스 라 군제 세네다 다 룽아기 남유 칸데도직 아니 ngazo 라 딱과체나 아니 디 참부 용사레스 라 룽아기 남유 칸데도직 다 닝지 여갱이 미지기나 아오 룽아기 남유 덴데지 튀ong거레디 ngazo기 따기 인슬라니 어디 가리가리 요레디 공부시로나스.
So why don't you take 5 to 7 minutes as a group and just kind of talk amongst yourselves and you know, think of like what would be, how would you advise us, how would you advise ourselves now as researchers of behaviors that we should be studying in science to really capture compassion. So talk amongst yourselves and then we'll come back and have a conversation.
대단데 향주 까마 투드인직 라 링갈라 투두나네 라더 닝지다 갸라고 데 닝지 심주칭에 센리발라 향주게 롭소도 야이네다 수수 심주체 이네다 디낭로라다 군주 칸데도직 라 기 아니 닝지 여바 춘기래 라 제가 닝지 여메다 닝지 다체 카르소레 토르 로마도다 정달라 되는 닝지 톱마 코규라 닝지 아니 공배 로마도 따야라스 군주도 가리가리 아니 라타사레 라 군주 칸데지게 코 닝지 여바 춘사레 다디 저도나로나스.
Okay. So we'll just have a little bit of a conversation, and Dongdup will take some notes. How do you think that we should be studying compassion? What are things that we should be focusing on? Yeah.
No. No.
네, 다단다게 치주하고 노동대 아니 다가서 도와리는 메시던 치치는 치게다 상주성과 로든지 저기 되는 저기는 세마달리 시서라 텔라네 저기 단 세마 텔라테네 텔라 요메 다시 탄데 생각에 다시 나야 그런 거 링하고 조금 텔라다고야 텔라네 다시 심지 제고지레스 어다테네 양용도 달랐어.
So the discussion that we had, we used a verse from Buddha's Sutra that just as we use signs and indications to infer smoke as a sign and the reason to infer fire, and then presence of water, birds to indicate water, presence of water. Similarly, for bodhisattvas, whether someone is bodhisattva or have these propensities, we look at their signs and indications. And these could include, how someone would respond. For instance, to a teaching of compassion or to a discussion on compassion, their emotional responses and how enthusiastic they are about that. And then there are also physical signs and behavioral signs, such as being generous, being respectful of others, and so on. So these behavior, just observing them once or twice is not enough to indicate, they are practitioners of compassion or they are bodhisattvas. So you have to, make the observation repeatedly, to, establish that he has a practice of compassion or bodhicitta.
Wow. Beautiful point. I love the smoke signal image, and I love the point of needing to see it multiple times. Yeah.
And issue. The issue was and the game gone jisons that is Shumogachira. Tanganju dinalo, the Lu Gunjura Tata, the Nag Gunjura Tata, Tawacharo, E Gunjura Tata said. That Lu Gunjura Tata said, and the Penasim singing Dungero Paroba Dungi Narivana, and Dinega with Dungeli touch Trelli, unnecessary Lu Gunaka, Kazukanduchi to that, Pembata, that Tuzuta and Karina Yonchora. That the name President Shaban and Namsha United Kida with that the name Takujagan di Jora. The Kozu Tuzu Kazutang to do. The Negatoni Kozuleta, Luton the town is but the Negatoni to Sondra Tanjora, the Negatoni and Lugun Tajisha Tanjiche. Young Agone Tata Che de Calananda, the Negangan Tedding and the Kaduin and that charge, and the Simsutana, that the Neguton to Tanjora. I am Kranzari division, young Kazet Kariche, Sijamo Karimagido, the Neton and Agatache. And you go in that the Negaton to call it Tuzutan, Chichizambala, and so Deva Kazu. Tangi Dinistan Master that reverse switch came over. That's the Legate Chibushi was younger, the next toy taken, and the Kansa Digal and Inji Yovadi, that was a port with race on the Chiri. And Taki gained this one, Gumdu that Sani Sungda. gumruda 체리세 지난 노조 나올 딱네 gumru 체리세리 거가 한데 자기나 띵아랑 직디 더바 용도라 gumru 체리세리 가시나 군딩 남준 단다 디와 남비 체리 남비 따두 남비 취세죠라 단다 gumru 체리세리 간주 답에 삼당매나 남비기 체리세 디네 갑자로 두고이나 근데 코란데 공부 시당저라 대시도 한데 자기나 어디 conditions.
So we were discussing about ways in which this behavior can manifest, right? Behavior that we would associate with compassion can manifest. So it could be physical action, it could be verbal, or it could be even emotional. So physical would be, taking care of people who are suffering, right? So this could be actually going there. Here, there are many stray dogs, that are suffering. So, you take care for them. Such physical manifestation could be used as, indications of compassion. It could be, and then spending time with someone, right, who is suffering. It could be verbal in that, the person, the way he, talks with that person, the way he interacts with that person. It could be even emotional, right? So, how do these people feel when they reflect on what they did, right? If they are deriving joy by reflecting on that, that indicates that, compassion is genuine. So these are some of the ways, I think, some of the behaviors that we can observe. We need not restrict just to physical, behaviors. And then, Tundu has a question about, contemplative science that you mentioned. His Holiness, when he generally categorizes Buddhism into these three, different sections: Buddhist science and Buddhist religion and Buddhist philosophy, right? So when we talk about contemplative science, are we referring to Buddhist science, or what exactly are we? How should we understand contemplative science? So that's his question.
Can I maybe ask you a question? In this perspective, what's the difference between Buddhist science and Buddhist philosophy?
So dina alola ta nangbe tseri da tarup gi kheba kharres.
And Nambi Cherry than Tatu said, Kunding than that the Makoshakin on the Zambarwa. Cherry said in Alota, Penasuchin to the and a shipping Namshati, Nambi Cherry knowledge Shayora. That the Maime, that the Tava person do that, Dame Betava the Carne City, Navita to Jago Sungora. The Nambi Church, that Teva that David and Yamnech Town got it, Zimbabwe Sierra.
So the way His Holiness is categorizing is Buddhist science, is all the understanding and knowledge about the physical world and also the mental world, right? So the emotions, the mind and the mental factors and so on. These are included in Buddhist science, right? So anything that could be empirically observed. Buddhist philosophy would include concepts like emptiness and selflessness and so on, right? And then Buddhist religion would involve practices that are more dependent on faith and belief.
I mean, I think from a research perspective, we could investigate all three. So I think, for example, in Buddhist science, we could study the mental factors and the afflictive emotions and develop questions around that. In Buddhist philosophy, we could develop research questions of the role of emptiness and the perception of interdependence, and maybe even Buddhist logic on the mind and brain and how that affects people's behavior. And Buddhist religion, it could be that certain practices that are very fundamental may have positive effects on the body, positive effects on the brain. So we could actually study those behaviors, not so much to interrogate the behaviors, but to understand what the positive effects are on the brain and body of engaging in those type of behaviors. So I think we need to be very precise in our research questions, but I think all three of those categories could have really exciting scientific opportunities for a conversation between science and Buddhism.
지단 탄다 대생 숨 예와체 디숨가 아니 낭로라 첸리기 심주 줍투야 통구도스 라 더 낭베 첸리기 토라 유나 더고 셈중다 아니 셈용라 소바도 예와선자 돈주 갈 심주 체지 용거라 아니 더줍단 데네 더 심주라 베나 아니 동바니 곰바디기 아니 카르소레 셈다 더 레바라 슈겐 카르도 세야다야 셰바 기 아니 카르소레다 가주 레발라 수 아니 슈겐다 제와 카르도 라속베 지와도즈 페제 아니 따루기 쳔바나라 용초로 와스 데네 최기 아니 쳔바디 낭로라다 심주로 베나 아니 최다 베나 대바체야라 속바다야 고 최초기 락렌딘데기 아니 강사 도다수수기 아니 류단 최된다 레바단도 줄라 슈켄 카르도 따야 라다 생가 숨가 낭로라 생리기 심주 페제 레초야직 통고도 스터디 영아주 티와 괴단다 티와로 노수된다는데기 개발인 거로 왔어.
But the one final point I'd say is, as a scientist, I think it's important for me to be very humble in this conversation, because ultimately you now are developing research skills and you have much deeper knowledge than I have about Buddhist science, Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist religion. So we don't have the time to go back and forth right now, but I would love to ask you the question, and maybe you can think about it and we can talk about it the next time we come together. How would you see research being relevant to each three of those categories that His Holiness suggests? Because I trust your perspective much more than mine, because I'm very new to my understanding of Buddhism.
Kena Quran sendiri berjimbe chane endi gausu ta susu masimba rwa ani susu ki kodola ta cik karsureng ajo madangwe chakari badi munzi sebu chekoya de ngarang kechin butong dos dine indi ta cengka sumgi nanglo la ani cengri ki simju khandes chena yaksare kari kari chetupsare di peche number chogi ani yaga kengi res ra di indi tanda ngajo da di twedu chegi tizo yo mare jema ani ngajo nyamdo zombe kapsu ya di gala ngajo ki ani twedu chechogu res. So his question about how Western science is understanding contemplative science. So what does contemplative science include?
It includes many things. And I think fundamentally contemplative science, from a Western perspective, is interested in the effect primarily of, I would say, Buddhist practice, less religion, probably less philosophy, but really understanding the effect of meditation training on the emotions, on the brain, on the body. I will say that contemplative science in America is fairly secularized, so it doesn't involve a lot of the kind of religious components that come with Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. But it's really examining the extent to which mind training practices can have positive effects on the brain and the body.
Tadanda gomdrup chenri se dinanglo la the engineer contemplative science la dinga zu chu gyurdu gomdrup chenri gyurgo ra dinanglo la the mangbuchi lechog res ra ani ina za zo ani gomgi gom gyabala tene ani sugula shugen treden la shugen semyon la shugen dinde khantes thepgido ra dila ani chebachigi ores ra dinanglo la da nangbege nyamle ani dine yongchog res ra ine thade chala ani tendadi kharsure gomrup senri se di ani ta chela matembe ngola shukchimbu shiuji lenru res ra di imba sonja da ya nangbe thumum mambe kharsure chedan jewe duzo da kharsore thande chala da di gomrup seri di ani secularize la di da chola maden be ngodi ani shukcheru cheru tugu yores donna da laglen da nyamlen khande jigi ne ya ko subu da ni sem da du zula shukyen khande stegi dorwa lojong gi nanglo ne ta laglen mangbu jigi ro ani sugu da sem la shukyen tegi was du zu ani du zula takche che di ani gomrup seri na le du res.
I think CBCT and C-Learning are beautiful examples of contemplative science. At Mind and Life, I will say, I'm taking more of a leadership role, not a leadership role, but getting more involved in Mind and Life. And one of the things I'm really advocating for is pulling more on you all to help guide contemplative science and making opportunities for you all to get more involved in Mind and Life and in American contemplative science, because I think the field would so benefit from the depth of knowledge you have on compassion, mind, etc., that I think that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to really create a cross-cultural conversation together. And so it's not Americans doing contemplative science, it's all of us kind of investigating these techniques in a more collaborative way.
Gomba shecho chera di ta tanda gomrup seri slide di nanglo la rwa ta ngune kora gomrup seri nyamle gomrup nyamle chede gengi ani chiso duzu ta ko dewa khasu manga yona ya di ani seri di sabdu doya da chudu doya de chi ki yes samlo tangi yes di basunza ngela kora ta tanda semda so gi seri nanglo la ani nyamshu ta ta ani ta chi ke kharso re ge neti gi ani gen cheru cheru ani lembe kap de la ani gyala khorang gi ta semda so gi seri tabu du gi komru seri ga la shu kya gi ba indi ani khazu thubdu gi number so gi ani dinalo la chi ke kharso re nyamshu che thoya chigla ani shu kya gi yes de di nenga chim butong dos
la sa de sanga zu tsawa gi teder chi gi ta tangbo ning bato ningji ani ningji lorwa setende la yong de pena chelo me ningji la de mantasa la tonyo to le zi singu yo che to che da ta na jeng ni karsa gonda mengmele me ningji chelo me ningji la de ani mata ba to le zi singu ase la de che thongbo re do ta persheng shimba ta sim ta ningji ta ta na jeng ge ani ngazo ningji lorwa se la de tegi de simju chi gi na ta na ngazo kunju de la lu nga yi sim gu kunju yorwa ta de la ta ngazo tan de dinar chu de pena ta kaji chigla tanda be simchan la jimba tanga yo suru jida mila chig chamkyong chig yo wada tegi dinga zo te samgi ani chig ningji po thogu de sen te samgi po thogu mu de pe cha jana ta ko chig soso kepeng che de de chi ma ge de che mangu yong chog ro de indi tanga zo be na che ni de chi tangbo de ani kar re si di gyund ne met be na me chig la simchi chi yo de me de gi gyundong lo gi chig de tinyam de le ya khoran la lo ni sum chig la nang lo la an khoran ko konjo kheta mila la keje shedan iner kunje kedan dis tuju di gyurin su ta chikche chik dela ani shemba dela pena me chigla ningji ge korla ani da ko gom gya chuya da di ko la ya da lorjo mango chik lap gom gya chu teni chin dingo gum me te ge kunje kedan te la ani simju ji che te shi sha ko ani teni zebe lo ni sam ge jila ani me te kunje la yo kar do de lunga yi sam kunje len yo ngan da tendi si che
plus. So this question will depend on how we are defining compassion. In Buddhism, there are different categories of compassion, right? Compassion, mere compassion, in that the compassion is just not influenced or impacted by other your insights. Then there are non-referential compassion, and the other one, I'm not sure, compassion that's influenced by your understanding of everything being impermanent. So depending on how you are defining compassion, right, I think the behavior indication may change, may differ. But one thing that as a group we discuss is doing longitudinal studies where we follow someone or a group for extended period of time and then compare their behavior pre and post and then see the efficacy of training and so on, right? So, first it will depend on how we are defining compassion, and then it may require extended study.
Yeah, yeah.
tanda chila special nazo ningji gi jangdar dinde te and gom ge dinde chiundi ningji lower wa sena da kandar choa ge wangi chuma chiro choa ge wangi chuma chiro di lower wa shu jire se pena ta tandi nima chigla ani ningji shu ki so so pesha ten te to jan la khar roram chin che to baina sanya ko me kima na jin chin be samlo kedan de be tagaran cha dio karjan ko gyun tu de 제자 닝지 로로스는 다 간들 초와 왕게 총디 닝지 문제 제단시라 근데 인디 맞아 닝지 문제 제단데 맨날 샴페인 상로 유니 데라 닝지 요세기임베 아니 대화 종교데 밀레 야고치기 상모 닝지 콘도 쓰기 인생의 디 마르와 디인디 닝지 코란데 제와데 로스 니치 문제 서우치도 이렇게 좀
And then there are limitations in terms of in terms of how behavior can indicate compassion, because often what seems to be compassionate acts may not be motivated by real compassion, right? There could be ulterior motives and so on. So this extended study would, address to a certain degree this limitation, but then also, some compassions are induced by or inspired by how you are feeling in the moment, right? Induced by emotions that you are feeling, and the resultant behavior of such compassion may not occur, when that emotion changes, when that feeling, changes. So, looking at instances of, generous act and so on, may not be enough or sufficient to indicate compassion.
So these are really important insights. First of all, remind me of your name.
Jamyang.
Jamyang. So Jamyang highlights, one, the importance of definition. Absolutely critical when we think about doing research on the topic of compassion. Essential.
직 nga줄 tenso 가르쳐서 제바이나 아니 심주 제베 가서 아니 심주 제사기 다 내던 가리나 디베 세부 시우지게 토네 nga줄 문진 제야다 고된 자리야디.
Jamyang discusses the importance of intention, right? Because I'm in Buddhist, philosophy and intention is really critical. We see a lot of compassionate behaviors that actually may be not very compassionate because they might be more to pull in, benefits for the self. So as scientists, a challenge that we'll have is how do we actually not only just study the behavior, but actually study, or if we can study, what's the underlying intention below the behavior?
Entana shin Korangi the Gulongi Kordi Chik Sumbarwas Kazinata Shenla Pentobe any Chaju Tsangma Koningji Kunelombe Kabake Marwas Ra that's also Rande and Dubiala Mine any Chike Pento Chela so what in the Chebaina that the Ningji Kunelonga Maimba the Inzanda 심주 책임직 심주 책임직이 뭐네 다디 칸데스 가서 예와 책임바 라 아니 군주랑라 따네 아니 파주 군론디 포투그메나 아니 군론디 거기 다디 군주디 아니 닝지 아니 군론 임바디양 가서 칸데스 보고래 디에 직 가서 삼로당고에 지레도 왔어.
But then Jamyang switches from what the problem is to actually thinking about what the solution is, which is, well, maybe with a longitudinal design, we can start to unpack that. And that as we move forward as researchers and monastic scientists, I think we need to really think about how do we turn these challenges into research designs that kind of best manage those challenges.
that 강에도 중을 송네 코란기 탑람직다 가리 숭바레슬라바이나 고 유릉부치네 아주 다 제바체 주라 디 디날다 인지널 longitudinal studies 라고도 딱제 직고 딱제 고수네 고 로망부지랭가라 다라 또 딱제디 무튜네 줘야디 제자다 딘데게 토네 양 아주 가리보 투사레 어디 공자낭순스.
So it's break time. Let's take a 30-minute break. I'll come back and start with your point. I want to make sure you've got time to just work as groups, but let's take a little bit of the beginning of the next session to continue the conversation for a moment, and then we'll start to turn into being able to just work as on your project. So if you could hold your thought, we'll start at 10:30, and we'll see you after break.
어쨌든 수자 발생체 아니 수자네 출로네 아니 아주 투저도스 단다디 트도디 모투네 슈기인스 아니 디바도 향게 수수 삼로디 송로제스 아니 디네네야 캬ンズ 단다 달레가 마차에 망고제로아 두주 제야래야 견라기 투저도스 식샤긴스